It is amazing that with all these biases, people are able to actually have a rational thought every now and then. There is no end to the mistakes we make when we process information, so here are 10 more common errors to be aware of. Number 10. Endowment Effect. The endowment effect is the idea that people will require more to give up an object than they would pay to acquire it. It is based on the hypothesis that people place a high value on their property. Certainly, this is not always an error. For example, many objects have sentimental value or are priceless to people. However, if I buy a coffee mug today for $1 and tomorrow demand $2 for it, I have no rationality for asking for the higher price. This happens frequently when people sell their cars and ask more than the book value of the vehicle, and nobody wants to pay the price. This bias is linked to two theories. Loss aversion says that people prefer to avoid losses rather than obtain gains. And status quo bias says that people hate change and will avoid it unless the incentive to change is significant. Number 9. Restraint Bias. The restraint bias is the tendency to overestimate one's ability to show restraint in the face of temptation or the perceived ability to have control over an impulse, generally relating to hunger, drug, and sexual impulses. The truth is that people do not have control over visceral impulses. You can ignore hunger, but you can't wish it away. You might find the saying, "the only way to get rid of temptation is to give into it," amusing. However, it is true. If you want to get rid of your hunger, you have to eat. Restraining from impulses is incredibly hard. It takes great self-control. However, most people think they have more control than they actually do. For example, most addicts say that they can quit anytime they want to, but this is rarely the case in real life. Number 8. Self-serving bias. A self-serving bias occurs when an individual attributes positive outcomes to internal factors and negative outcomes to external factors. A good example of this is grades. When I get a good grade on a test, I attribute it to my intelligence or good study habits. When I get a bad grade, I attribute it to a bad professor or poorly written exam. This is very common as people regularly take credit for successes but refuse to accept responsibility for failures. When considering the outcomes of others, we attribute causes exactly the opposite as we do to ourselves. When we learn that the person who sits next to us failed the exam, we attribute it to an internal cause. That person is stupid or lazy. Likewise, if they ace the exam, they got lucky, or the professor likes them more. This is known as the fundamental attribution error. Number 7. Illusion of control. Illusion of control is the tendency for individuals to believe they can control or at least influence outcomes that they clearly have no influence on. This bias can influence gambling behavior and belief in the paranormal. In studies conducted in psychokinesis, participants are asked to predict the result of a coin flip. With the two-sided fair coin, participants will be correct 50% of the time. However, people fail to realize that probability or pure luck is responsible and instead see their correct answers as confirmation of their control over external events. When playing craps in casino, people will throw the dice hard when they need a high number and soft when they need a low number. In reality, the strength of the throw will not guarantee a certain outcome, but the gambler believes they can control the number they roll. Number 6. Cryptomnesia. Cryptomnesia is a form of a misattribution where a memory is mistaken for imagination, also known as inadvertent plagiarism. This is actually a memory bias where a person inaccurately recalls producing an idea or thought. There are many proposed causes of cryptomnesia, including cognitive impairment and lack of memory reinforcement. However, it should be noted that there is no scientific proof to validate cryptomnesia. The problem is that the testimony of the afflicted is not scientifically reliable. It's possible that the plagiarism was deliberate and the victim is a dirty thief. Number 5. Availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is gauging what is more likely based on vivid memories. The problem is individuals tend to remember unusual events more than everyday, commonplace events. For example, airplane crashes receive lots of national media coverage. Fatal car crashes do not. However, more people are afraid of flying than driving a car, even though statistically airplane travel is safer. Media coverage feeds into this bias. Because rare or unusual events such as medical errors, animal attacks, and natural disasters are highly publicized, people perceive these events as having a higher probability of happening. Number 4. Planin fallacy. The Planin fallacy is the tendency to underestimate the time needed to complete tasks. The Planin fallacy actually stems from another error, the optimism bias, which is the tendency for individuals to be overly positive about the outcome of planned actions. People are more susceptible to the Planin fallacy when the task is something they have never done before. The reason for this is because we estimate based on past experiences. For example, if I ask you how long it takes you to grocery shop, you will consider how long it has taken you in the past, and you will have a reasonable answer. If I ask you how long it will take you to do something you have never done before, like completing a thesis of climbing Mount Everest, you have no experience to reference. And because of your inherent optimism, you will guesstimate less time than you really need. To help you with this fallacy, remember Hofstadter's law. It always takes longer than you expect, even if you take into account Hofstadter's law. Number 3. Confirmation bias. The confirmation bias is the tendency to look for or interpret information in a way that confirms beliefs. Individuals reinforce their ideas and attitudes by selectively collecting evidence or retrieving biased memories. For example, I think that there were more emergency room admissions on nights where there is a full moon. I notice on the next full moon that there are 78 ER admissions. This confirms my belief, and I failed to look at admission rates for the rest of the month. The obvious problem with this bias is that it allows inaccurate information to be held as true. Going back to the above example, suppose that on average, daily ER admissions are 90. My interpretation that 78 are more than normal is wrong, yet I failed to notice or even consider it. This error is very common, and it can have risky consequences when decisions are based on false information. Number 2. Bias blind spot. The bias blind spot is the tendency not to acknowledge one's own thought biases. In a research study conducted by Emily Planin of Princeton University, participants were described different cognitive biases such as the halo effect and self-serving bias. When asked how biased the participants themselves were, they rated themselves as less biased than the average person. Amazingly, there is actually a bias to explain this bias. The better than average bias is the tendency for people to inaccurately rate themselves as better than the average person on socially desirable skills or positive traits. Coincidentally, they also rate themselves as lower than average on undesirable traits. Number 1. Just world phenomenon. The just world phenomenon is when witnesses of an injustice, in order to rationalize it, will search for things that the victim did to deserve it. This eases their anxiety and allows them to feel safe. If they avoid that behavior, injustice will not happen to them. This peace of mind comes at the expense of blaming the innocent victim. To illustrate this, a research study was done by Al Carley of Wellesley College. Participants were told 2 versions of a story about interactions between a man and a woman. In both versions, the couple's interactions were exactly the same. At the very end, these stories differed. In one ending, the man raped the woman, and in the other, he proposed marriage. In both groups, participants described the woman's actions as inevitably leading up to the different results. If you have ever noticed any of these judgment errors in your life, leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos.